Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for your patience while we sorted out a few technical glitches. So without further ado, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us at today's event, where Advocata will be launching its new report, A Framework for Economic Recovery. We are honored to have with us a very distinguished panel of experts who will be joining for a live Q&A with media and with the public. But before this, we will also have a short presentation of the key findings of this report by Dr. Roshan Perera. I would like to flag for everyone that live language interpretation in Sinhala and Tamil is available for this event. You can follow the instructions that will show up on the screen momentarily to access this option. Essentially, at the bottom of your Zoom panel, there should be a little globe icon that will allow you to switch channels to a language of your preference. If you have any issues with this, please drop a message on the chat and our team will be happy to help you. A few more comments before we start our discussion today. I would like to kindly request that everyone on Zoom keeps their microphone switched off for the duration of the session, unless we are called upon. We'll be starting today's discussion with introductory comments by Dhananath Fernando, COO of the Advocata Institute, and then this will be followed by Dr. Roshan's presentation. After this, we will open the floor for questions, both from Zoom, where we have members of the press with us here today, and also from the general audience who will be joining us on Facebook and YouTube. Today's event is also being live streamed on the following pages: The Morning Business, News Hub English, Other, Citizen.lk, and Economy and Business Sri Lanka. We are also live on Advocata's Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Twitch pages in English, and the Sinhala interpretation will be live streamed on the Advocata Plus Facebook page. So now, without further ado, I would love to introduce our panelists for today. Dr. Roshan Perera, author of our report today, is a senior research fellow of the Advocata Institute. She has over 20 years of experience in formulating and implementing monetary policy at the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. And additionally, Dr. Roshan Perera is a consultant to various institutions such as the Institute of Policy Studies, World Bank, and UNDP. Dr. Sarath Rajapatirana is the chair of the academic program at the Advocata Institute. He has worked at leading international organizations such as the World Bank, WTO, ITC in Geneva, and the International Cooperative Alliance in Latin America. He is also the vice president of the Sri Lanka Economists Association. Mr. Murtaza Jaffrji is the chairperson of the Advocata Institute. He was a past president of the CFA Society of Sri Lanka and the local member society of the CFA Institute, and has also held the advocacy chair, whose responsibilities include promoting good ethical practices. He was formerly an elected director of the Colombo Stock Exchange, among holding many other positions. Mr. Dhananath Fernando is the Chief Operating Officer and one of the founding members of the Advocata Institute. He was an associate research director at Breakthrough Business Intelligence, a leading market research agency in Sri Lanka, and is an alumnus of the International Visitor Leadership Program by the State Department of the United States of America. Professor Premachandra Athukorala is an eminent professor of economics at the Arden Corden Department of Economics, College of Asia and the Pacific at the Australian National University. He is also a member of the advisory board of the Advocata Institute and a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia and an honorary professorial research fellow at the University of Manchester. Professor Rohan Samarajiva is the founding chair of Learn Asia, an ICT policy and regulation think tank that is active across emerging Asia and the Pacific. He is also a board member of the advisors of Advocata Institute and Sarvodaya. Professor Samarajiva was a team leader at the Sri Lanka Ministry for Economic Reform, Science and Technology, as well as Director General of Telecommunications in Sri Lanka. He was also an honorary professor at the University of Moratuwa. Professor Suri Ratnapala is a professor at the University of Queensland and a fellow of the Australian Academy of Law. He is also a member of the advisory board of the Advocata Institute. He was elected to the membership of the Mont Pelerin Society, an international group of liberal intellectuals. He is an Alan McGregor Fellow of the Center for Independent Studies and has received fellowships from prestigious international research centers. Anarkali Munasinghe currently serves on the board of directors of Keel's Hotels PLC and the Lankan Angel Network. She is a member of the advisory board of the Advocata Institute and brings with her a demonstrated history of working in the financial services industry. Dr. Sujata Gamage is a senior research fellow at LearnAsia, a regional think tank based in Colombo, and a member of the board of advisors of the Advocata Institute. She specializes in planning, evaluation, and capacity building in education, ICT in education, research and research networks, and public sector performance using data analytics, institutional research, scoping studies, systematic reviews, and simulations. Dr. Nishan Dimel is the Executive Director and Head of Research of Verity Research and a member of the Board of Advisors of the Advocata Institute. He has also served as an Executive Director of the International Center for Ethnic Studies and on the board of the Sri Lanka Foundation Institute. He has taught and researched economics at both Oxford and Harvard University. Last but definitely not least is Professor Sirimal Aberatna, a professor in economics at the University of Colombo and current chairman of the Monetary Policy Consultative Committee of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. He is also a member of the advisory board of the Advocata Institute and has been a visiting fellow at universities in Japan, Vietnam, Australia, and Italy, and has served as a consultant to many international organizations, government agencies, and corporate sector organizations in Sri Lanka. As is now probably very clear to anyone, we're very honored to have such an esteemed panel of intellectuals and experts with us here today. And while we are all looking forward to hearing from them, I would now like to hand the microphone over to Dhananath, who will give some brief introductory remarks.
Thank you very much, Anita. And I would like to warmly welcome all of you, our advisors, our chairman, and the members of the press, and all who are joining with us on Facebook, on YouTube, and all social media platforms. Thank you very much. Basically, the reason why we thought to have this press conference and this session, of course, it is not a secret that economy-wise, we are passing a very difficult time. And in our analysis, we are facing an unprecedented economic crisis. So with this economic crisis have been admitted by the government, opposition, independent analysts. So in fact, the Minister of Finance in his recent speech took a proverb to explain that we are in between three life-threatening challenges, and even the opposition and everybody admitted that we are facing an unprecedented economic crisis. So in our belief that unprecedented economic crisis can only be overcome by structural, comprehensive economic reforms. Unfortunately, there will be no shortcuts. And in what we believe is these economic reforms have to be a combined effect and a combined effort across all the pillars of our economy. That means the monetary system, narrowing down on the budget deficit, managing our debt, embracing global trade, increasing our productivity and joining global production networks and value chains, and also amendments in the legal and regulatory framework, also improving ease of doing business, and many more structural reforms has to be done if we were to overcome this economic crisis. However, we all know economic reforms are not easy. It will be painful. But if we delay the reforms, it will be further painful, and the generations to come, in terms of prosperity and quality of life, it may not be a very pleasant experience. And obviously, there is no point at this point pointing fingers at each other, because what we see is it's 70 years of economic mismanagement and reluctance for proper economic reforms in brewing, which is reaching to a boiling point, has made to where we are at the moment. So on that context, we thought we should launch a framework for economic recovery, which would help people of Sri Lanka and the policymakers to proceed during this turbulent time when it comes to economic reform. So I thank Dr. Roshan in particular for being the main author of this report. and also to our chairman and all our advisors and the research team for making this report available, and a productive report for all our researchers as well as for public and policymakers. And very importantly, in this report, we are not planning to do a post-COVID aftermath and how we should face it, because in our view, our economic issues have been there for a long time. And of course, COVID-19 accelerated the problems, but in this report, we are going beyond that. We are going beyond the COVID and highlighting and reiterating the need for comprehensive structural economic reforms. And when it comes to COVID, Advocata has done 4 main webinars on COVID impact on exports, on banking, on tourism, and overall on macroeconomic, which is available on our YouTube, and anybody can see the detail that we have gone through post-COVID. So basically what we recommend is there has to be, mainly in terms of reforms, that our debt has to be managed, and also there has to be serious reforms needs to be done to our monetary system. And at the same time, we have to conduct a credible analysis in the first place to build confidence that we are good for money, and at the same time to get the binding of all stakeholders to conduct reforms. And also finally, all these reforms have to be very well coordinated. All the economic pillars working hand in hand, and it's an ecosystem. And the trade reforms, the legal reforms, the debt management, monetary system, all has to be done simultaneously and in a very well coordinated manner. So thank you very much for joining us today, and we are looking forward to engage with you, and the report will be on our website and all our social media channels, so you can go through it in detail. But Dr. Roshan will give a overall picture of the report, and I would like to hand it over to Anita. Thanks, Anita.
Thank you, Daranath. Dr. Roshan, we are ready when you are.
Thank you, Anita. I'll just share my screen. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you to everybody who's here. Before we actually the framework for this economic recovery, I thought it would be good if we kind of spend a little time to ensure that we are all on the same page in terms of what our expectations are for the economy, and how would we characterize a healthy economy. So that's the first one. Second one, how do we diagnose an economy? So what kind of indicators do we use? And can we really attempt to put things right, to take the kind of policy actions that are necessary to correct any imbalances? So it is, can you see my screen? Is it okay? Yeah.
Very clear.
It is likely that if you opened a newspaper this week, you would have been bombarded with lines like this. And as a consumer or producer, how do you make sense of all this? How do you decide to allocate your income between spending decisions and saving? How about to produce, when to produce? So for consumers and producers to be able to make long-term decisions, there needs to be stability in the economy. So then what do we mean by stability? So how do we characterize an economy that is stable or has a clean bill of health? So firstly, it should be an economy that is growing at a steady and sustainable rate. And where the inflation rate should be at a level that does not have a material bearing on the decision making of the agents of the economy, so consumers and producers. And thirdly, an economy should be resilient to both internal and external shocks, because whether we like it or not, there's always an element of uncertainty, and we're always buffeted by various shocks to our economic system. So in order to achieve this, an economy needs to have stability in both internal stability and external stability. And what do we mean by internal stability? Basically, what we mean is that where an economy is producing goods and services which are in line with the available resources in the economy. Basically, that the economy is operating at its optimal level, so that it is neither generating high levels of inflation nor deflation. And secondly, there needs to be external balance. What do we mean by that? Where it is where the demand for foreign goods is basically matched by our foreign inflows. And as a result, the current account balance, because there may be a current account deficit, but it can be financed in an orderly manner. However, if there's an excess demand for goods in the economy, which may arise from either governments running fiscal deficits or from high monetary growth, this would lead to an acceleration of inflation and cause an internal imbalance. But it also has an impact on the external balance, because it would also result in increasing the demand for foreign goods, and the need for foreign resources is additional demand. So how can we make an adjustment then? And then this may require either an abrupt adjustment in the exchange rate. It may require drawdown of foreign reserves or external financial assistance. And in extreme circumstances, it might even require result on the payments against the rest of the world. See, there's a direct link between the internal balance in economy and its external balance. So just to say this, I'm using a very familiar framework that we use, which is the national income identity. Where in an open economy, we say that national product is a function of our private consumption expenditure, our private investment expenditure, government expenditure, the difference between our exports and imports, our net factor income from abroad, and our net transfers. So I will leave you to work out the maths for those who are interested, but I just want you to focus on this last equation here, which is in the shaded area. So what is that telling us basically? It's telling us that the external current account balance, which is this, depends on our private savings balance, which is represented by the difference between our private savings and investment, and our fiscal balance, which is represented by the difference between government revenue, which governments earn through taxes, and government expenditure. So if a government continues to consume more than it earns, or domestic private savings are not sufficient to finance the investment in the economy, this would be reflected in a widening of our current account deficit. Once we understand this relationship, we realize that addressing the imbalances in the external sector necessarily means either reducing the government's deficit or raising domestic savings, or both. This then requires to address the fundamental imbalances in the economy, that is addressing the fiscal deficit or addressing our savings rates. And it's not, we can't simply address the symptoms, which may be, or the result of it, which may be high imports. That is only a symptom. We have to address the fundamental reasons for this external current account deficit. So let's take a look at how Sri Lanka has performed in these areas and whether that may shed some light on what is going on in the economy today. So if you look at Sri Lanka over, I've taken a few decades, You can see that Sri Lanka has been running for much of its post-independence period. You also notice a cyclical pattern, where at regular intervals, the fiscal deficit rates to around 10% of GDP. In fact, if you look at deficit in 2020, it even exceeded 10% of GDP and is likely to deteriorate further in 2021. And with that, I have put some shaded areas in this graph, which basically are the periods in which Sri Lanka was in the IMF program. And what you may notice is that the troughs in these cycles correspond to, or quite closely, I would say, to when we started a program with the IMF. Right? So that is quite clear here. Let's look at the movement in the current account, the external current account. You will see that the is very, very it mirrors, or it's very it moves very closely with movement in the overall fiscal deficit, right? So they move very closely together. But if you focus all your attention on the last years, you would notice there appears to be a reversal from around 2018. But this is largely on account of the strict import restrictions that were imposed. However, as we have seen in the latest statistics that were released, in the last 6 months, despite the strict import restrictions, the trade balance has been widening with lower inflows from tourism and remittances. The current account deficit is likely to widen. So why is this a problem? As I alluded to earlier, in the absence of sufficient domestic savings, the country basically has to depend on foreign savings to bridge this current account deficit. And how do they do that? Either you have to get foreign inflows through foreign direct investments, but in Sri Lanka, we have had a very poor track record in that. And what has happened, we've basically had to borrow from abroad. And this is basically what you see in terms of our foreign borrowings. So in the initial years, you'll notice that Sri Lanka, so the dark lines are basically lending from multilateral agents, and this gray line is from bilateral sources. You see that in the initial years of the 2000s, mid 2009 or 10, basically most of our financing came from bilateral and multilateral sources. So they were basically concessional financing. However, you will notice from late 2000, with our loss of access to these sources due to the country's graduation to the middle income status and its infrastructure spending program that it began, Sri Lanka began to start borrowing from either the financial markets and through its international sovereign bonds. So these loans are generally contracted at market interest rates, so obviously higher than what you would get through a concessional lender, and typically have very short grace periods. Consequently, by 2016, you'd see the share of foreign loans from these non-concessional sources was over 50%. And what has been the consequence of this is that it has had an impact on our debt service payments. Look at our debt service payments, basically you'll see that they have increased, really ballooned over time. And you look at our last few years, according to the Ministry of Finance, their estimates, in the next few years, from 21 to 26, Sri Lanka has around 25 billion, and I think this is a conservative estimate, of foreign debt obligations. And this does not take into account the foreign denominated debt, that is SLDBs and ISBs, that are held domestically, which in recent times have also increased quite significantly. So with lower inflows due to the pandemic and negative investor sentiment, plus our ratings downgrade, servicing these debts have been a challenge. But these are contractual obligations. There could be serious repercussions if a country defaults on its debt. Here we have seen is a steady drawdown on the country's foreign reserves to meet these debt obligations. So we've seen at the end of July, gross foreign official reserves declined to 2.8 billion, which was an import cover of 1.8 months. This has increased 3.5 due to various receipts of the IMF SDR allocations plus a country a swap with Bangladesh. But if you look at the data put out by the central bank for July, Sri Lanka still has foreign currency obligations amounting to billion falling due within the next 12 months. And the current reserve level is grossly inadequate to service these debts. Yes, we may have some inflows coming in, but there are also other obligations that the country has to meet. And using a country's foreign reserves to pay its obligations is not a good strategy in the long term, because foreign reserves actually play an important role in the economy. They act as a buffer or insurance against any possible shocks, about uncertainties that are there in the economy. They also help us to smooth fluctuations in the exchange rate, and they provide confidence to foreign investors. So using these foreign reserves pay off our debt may not be the best strategy. So then what do we need to do? So here is where we come to our policy proposals or the framework that we are putting out today. First, we need to basically address our macroeconomic imbalances. And primarily, we need to correct our fiscal deficit and the external current account deficit, because these have spillover effects into the rest of the economy through the interest rates, through the exchange rate. That is a key or the primary area that we need to focus on in the immediately, really. Secondly, of course, we need to also have growth, because you need to create jobs. People need to have incomes. So we need to improve our competitiveness. We need to improve our productivity. And for that, we will require various structural reforms. And finally, as I said, we need to build our buffers to strengthen the resilience of the economy to shocks in order to be able to cushion the economy. Strengthen the various sectors of the economy, we will be able to build these buffers to help us to cushion the economy when we face shocks. So when we talk about addressing the macroeconomic balances, most of these policy proposals to address macroeconomic balances are not to examine any macro stabilization program that has been implemented in Sri Lanka, or for that matter, in any country that has faced similar economic issues over decades. You would broadly find similar recommendations. But that is not to say that the recommendations have been wrong, but rather that successive governments have not followed through on all that are necessary for ensuring long-term macroeconomic stability and sustained economic growth. But the current situation we are in demands something even more than that. We need immediate attention to our debt issue. Because in all the previous stabilization programs, if you look at them, although debt has been highlighted as a concern, the program has sought to address it through a fairly strict fiscal consolidation program. But I would say this time is different. So what are the options that Sri Lanka has to deal with its debt issue? Of course, it can do nothing. And what I mean by do nothing is it can carry on as it is doing at present, utilizing whatever foreign inflows it gets to service its debt. But this will come at the cost of the rest of the economy. probably a limit. There is a limit to this strategy. And with foreign reserves depleted and the government running out of options to finance its foreign debt service obligations, there's a strong possibility of default. Although the government consistently maintain that it will meet its obligations. But as I said before, depleting or using our foreign reserves and prioritizing debt service payments over the facilitating of productive economic activity can be detrimental to the future of the economy. So there have been various other options also the government has adopted. One is debt monetization. It has attempted to monetize the debt, but then there are also costs to this strategy because it has undermined the independence of the central bank and led to high inflation, the signs of which we are already seeing in the economy. The government can resort to financial repression because what the government has said is it's trying to convert its foreign debt to domestic debt, but it's also artificially suppressing the domestic interest rates to keep these borrowing costs low. However, these will have serious implications for domestic savings and ultimately lead to a misallocation of resources. We could also do a debt conversion, such as debt to equity swaps, and I think those are some things that have been done in the past. So a medium management strategy for the country could include a combination of these options. However, what we need to stress is averting a default is paramount, as a default could disrupt the country's access to future financing. It has very strong repercussions or very adverse repercussions. It will reduce investor confidence. It will affect credit ratings. I mean, we already can, and it will have a negative impact on the reputation of the entire country. So it's not only the government's reputation, but the reputation of the entire country, all the businesses and banks and the entire structure of the economy, and carried on well into the future. And this has been seen in debt default place in other countries. So to minimize these costs, a debt restructuring program seriously needs to be considered. Yes, it is a very complex process, and securing a deal that will be acceptable to most creditors will not be an easy task. There are many stakeholders involved. There are conflicts of interest, but it is something that we will need to engage in. And engaging it with an internationally accepted institution such as the IMF may be something that we really need to consider. But any kind of restructuring process will have to be genuine and approached holistically. So it has to cover both restructuring, but also a strong macroeconomic stabilization program. Because if it is not approached, it's not genuinely, it is not completed as agreed, creditors might not give the country a second chance if the terms of the restructuring are not adhered to. So I think this is something that we really need to stress. But then there are other things that need to happen or need to be done to address these macroeconomic imbalances. And definitely one is we need to have fiscal consolidation. Because as we said at the beginning, one of the main reasons or the primary reason for the macroeconomic has been the fiscal deficits that we have been running over decades. And this consolidation has to be revenue centered. There has been a serious erosion in government revenue, and it has had serious implications for macroeconomic stability. So we need to have a comprehensive review of the tax system. I think the last comprehensive review was done as far back as 2009 under the chairmanship of Professor W.D. Lakshman, who was the former governor of the central bank, or the most recent governor. There are two objectives of this commission. One was to facilitate and accelerated growth, that is after the conflict, and secondly, to reverse the revenue decline. Unfortunately, this report never saw light of day, and its recommendations were not really implemented holistically. But the thing is, when this report was published, the tax revenue to GDP was averaged around 15% of GDP over this period 2005 to 2009. This has plummeted now to 8% of GDP. So you can see the urgency for addressing the decline in tax revenue. We have listed out several policies, but I'm not going to go through them. You can look at them. So this basically tells you the decline in the revenue, and we really don't know where this is heading this year. The next is, of course, so revenue is one side, but you also need to have public finance management. We find that you see that contractual obligations such as payment of salaries and pensions and interest payments account for a large share of government. And with the government facing these severe resource constraints, the increase in these expenditures, basically, it's an opportunity cost. So basically, you have to cut down on expenditure on other things like building your human capital and your physical capital. And this first. So from these, you can see basically one of the areas that really needs to be focused on is the rationalization of the public sector. And also, we have highlighted the need strengthening accountability mechanisms so that governments are held accountable for how they spend their resources that they receive through taxes and borrowing that are entrusted to them. Thirdly, of course, the major source of inefficiency in the economy are state enterprises, and continuing to maintain these inefficient SOEs through transfers from government basically once again reduces the funds available to other vital sectors of the economy or underfunded sectors. So there are various reform measures that we propose in this area, but I'll highlight that one of the key issues that much of the losses of these SOEs has largely fallen on the banks. And this has implications for macroeconomic and financial sector stability. Hence, the urgency basically for reforming this sector as well. And then, of course, we go to the monetary policy. What has happened is because of fiscal dominance, it has adversely affected the independence of monetary policy. Basically, central bank has been called upon to finance the government due to the widening fiscal deficits and the challenges faced by the government in raising foreign financing. And what has that resulted in basically is this huge growth in money supply and up of inflationary pressures, which we are now seeing with inflation steadily increasing. But what it basically shows is that the need for central bank to be prepared to unwind its accommodative monetary policy measures in a timely manner. However, increasing borrowing by the government from the central bank and other domestic sources makes it harder for a central bank to raise interest rates to address these inflationary pressures. So there is a conflict there. In addition, this rapid increase in monetary expansion is also exerting pressure on foreign reserves and the exchange rate. But maintaining the exchange rate stable to cushion the impact on foreign debt service payments should not be the policy priority. So what we want to stress is the central bank needs to focus on its priorities. It needs to keep a lid on inflation, maintain a flexible exchange rate, be their policy priorities if the central bank wants to achieve its objectives, its main objectives, primary objectives, which are economic stability. And this is what you see in the exchange rate. So you see a rapid monetary expansion is also having an impact on the exchange rate. And of course, we look at the external sector and the trade sector. We need policies to support trade and investment. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because some eminent economists on our panel who have much more experience in this area, and I will leave it to them to really discuss this in more detail. So then we come to the set of policy proposals relating structural reform. Now, we said that just as much as we need macroeconomic stability, we also need to ensure that there is growth. But if you look at Sri Lanka over many periods, actually, you see that our growth has been extremely volatile. There have been periods of accelerated growth due to several reasons. One is political economy reasons, where governments before elections, we go on a spending spree, mainly with the purpose of winning votes rather than really raising, the productive capacity of the economy to ensure growth in the medium term. And also we've seen this debt-driven infrastructure spending, particularly after the Civil War. But as you will notice that these growth spurts have been very short-lived. Have not been productivity-led growth. Secondly, this high growth has only been in certain sectors of the economy, and what we refer to as the non-tradable sectors. The construction industry, real estate, trading, financial services, etc. Whereas the manufacturing and agriculture have grown at a much slower rate. And this is also largely a function of the incentive structures in the economy, particularly in the way that we have maintained our exchange rates and interest rates. So addressing the structural weaknesses in the economy, improving productivity, enhancing competitiveness is vital for Sri Lanka to achieve a stronger, more inclusive and sustainable growth. So in this, what needs to be done? We have identified, this is not an exhaustive list by any means, but we have identified some priority areas that need to be addressed. One is we need to improve our doing business environment. Sri Lanka lags way behind countries like Malaysia, Vietnam, and Thailand. So we need to address what the barriers that prevent us from, or prevent investors from doing business in the country and prevent us from attracting investment. Access to land that has been identified as a binding constraint for economic growth. Hence, addressing the barriers investors acquiring land for projects needs to be urgently addressed. The other one is our labor markets. Sri Lanka has a plethora of acts and ordinances labor. Many of them outdated and need to be either repealed or to meet the current economic and social realities. Sri Lanka no longer enjoys a demographic dividend and has a rapidly aging population. But it can tap into a large proportion of its population, which is still outside the labor force. For many, only about a third of our female population have entered the labor force. And there are many contributory factors for this. Laws that discourage part-time flexible work, lack of child, and these need to be urgently addressed. We also need to build our human capital. There needs to be greater focus on people and adding to the stock of skills and knowledge in the economy. There is a need to improve the relevance of education in line with the future needs of the economy. And we also particularly need to focus on our health outcomes. And this has become even more important in light of the pandemic. And what I want to say is, okay, we need to also bridge the infrastructure gap. because infrastructure is a key driver of growth and human development. It is necessary to enhance the productivity and efficiency of our factors of production. However, the impact of infrastructure depends a lot on its quality and effectiveness, cost effectiveness. Bad investments can jeopardize a country's debt sustainability and lead to the social and environmental problems as well. Hence, a priority should be to develop infrastructure which generates the highest economic and social returns, and to ensure that these projects are financed in a sustainable way that does not jeopardize our macroeconomic stability. So these are the framework for the policies that we recommend. As we said, these are not exhaustive, but what we believe or we think are crucial for a country, for Sri Lanka to move forward. Before I end, I just want to show you a snapshot or a summary of several macroeconomic stabilization programs we have had in Sri Lanka in the past. As you can see, there isn't much difference in the key areas of focus. All programs have focused on fiscal consolidation. There's a focus on SOE reform, on a flexible exchange rate regime. So how do we expect this time is going to be different? Thank you. Over to you, Advocata.
Thank you very much, Dr. Roshan, for that very insightful presentation. I won't speak for long. I will open the floor for questions in a minute, but I'd like to give a quick reminder to everyone who's listening in on Zoom that we have live interpretation in Sinhala and Tamil available, and that this is also being live streamed on the Advocata Facebook pages, with the Sinhala interpretation being live streamed on the Advocata Plus Facebook page. The link to the report that Dr. Roshan just presented on is available in the chat box, and it is also available on the Advocata website if you are interested. So without further ado, I'd like to open up the discussion to our audience here in Zoom today. If you have a question, just raise your hand. There's a reactions button at the bottom of the screen, and I'll call upon you to turn on your microphone and start discussing. Dr. Nishan Dimel, would you like to start us off?
Hi, Anita. I'll go first, one, because I have to leave in about 5 minutes. Two, because I know getting the first question is always hard. Roshan, just a clarification. When you said default, I assume you meant disorderly default, because you counter, you kind of against default, you said restructuring, which, we might also call is a default, but then that is a orderly default. So just a clarification that you are not saying that a orderly default would be extremely destructive, but a disorderly default would be extremely destructive, and the other option would be an orderly default, which you explained as a restructure. Am I right in understanding you that way?
Yes, that's right, Nishan. Because I think even in theory and in practice, between a default, which is something that it comes or just comes suddenly on you, or it's not that it's unexpected, but it just it comes very suddenly. Whereas a restructuring is a kind of a gradual adjustment of your debt.
Super, thank you. That was my question. Yeah.
Thank you. Ruhana Irfan, I think you have your hand up. If you would like to unmute and pose your question. Okay, while we wait, Professor Premachandra Atkurala, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, Anita, would it be okay, don't ask a question, but make few comments?
Sure, of course.
Or I can wait until others ask.
Go ahead, Professor.
Yeah, Roshan did an excellent presentation. I would like to congratulate both Roshan and the Advocata team, I think this is a very promising start for the discussion about economic reform in the country. I want to make 3 quick comments. Firstly, I like very much the way you presented the simple analytical framework. The external balance is basically a mirror image of the internal balance. But I want to add 2 clarifications to this story. I think it is very important. Firstly, we should not forget the fact that Sri Lanka is not a reserve currency country. We borrow in foreign currency. Say a country like Australia, Japan, or US, when they issue government bonds, they are denominated in their own currency. Therefore, the option of what you call debt monetization, that means creating domestic debt and then paying loan, is not a problem for these countries, right? But this is a point ignored by many commentators in Sri Lanka. They say that debt is not going to be a problem, but we are not a reserve currency country. Therefore, managing foreign debt in fact led to budgetary problems to the exchange rate changes. We need to take that into account. The second point, you correctly pointed out that external balance is the sum of private sector balance and the public sector balance. But from policy point of view, one important thing is what is the most important, private sector balance or the public sector balance? Think about Australia. Australia has been running current account deficit for more than 100 years, right? It has not created the problem simply because the major source of current account deficit is the private sector balance. Private sector borrow or domestic saving to invest in profitable debt repayment ability in good projects. In Sri Lanka, the biggest problem is that out of the 2 sources of domestic deficit, it is the public sector deficit that has contributed to the problem, right? Over the last 4 decades, other than in 1 year, we have been running a public sector deficit. Now, therefore, current account deficit is not always bad. If it is financing profitable private sector activity, that's not a problem like in Australia. That is the Sri Lankan problem. Therefore, when it comes to structural adjustment policies, we need to play a very big emphasis on the budgetary situation in a country like this. And that's a saying that when it comes to a country like that, IMF mean it is mostly fiscal, right? IMF, it is mostly fiscal, the adjustment step. Then my second comment relates to your policy prescriptions. You mentioned IMF package in passing, maybe because of political sensitivity. In my view, when you analyze Sri Lankan situation in the global context, I think there is no other alternative. We are postponing. When things become worse, the government is going to go to the IMF with in hand. It is true. But then I want to make one point. Under a solid IMF package, we don't have to give priority to debt restructuring. IMF, a good IMF, actually our situation is not that worse compared to Zambia or something, right? A solid IMF package would involve arranging a debt consortium by the IMF. In previous structural adjustment packages, debt consortium had contributed more money than what the IMF contribute. We need to take this into account. Again, when you enter into an IMF package, our creditworthiness increase. I think through an IMF package, we can avoid the dirty game of debt restructuring. That's my third point. I'll take 1 minute. You came up with a lot of policy prescriptions. I think we can't do everything at one go. Prioritizing needed reform is very important. I think in Sri Lankan context, when you go to an IMF package, I think our policy should focus on 2 areas. Firstly, balance of payment adjustment policy, including trade reforms and foreign investment reform. At the same time, the budgetary issues, the revenue-based reform. Actually, during the Hapalana regime, during the last 3 years, under Dr. Kumaraswamy's leadership at the central bank, public revenue reform implemented and they worked. And for the first time in 3 decades, the primary balance of the budget turned out to be positive for 2 years. And the current government ignored and backtracked from that reform. That is a very big issue. Thank you. Then the third point is very important. We can come up with a very long list, but at this stage, we need to prioritize. Thank you. It was a good presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Advocata. Dr. Nishan, I see you have your hand raised. Would you like to go ahead?
Sorry, I can wait, but I can also speak. Just to reply, Chandra, and connect it to Roshan also very briefly. I think the additional discussion we need is about the dynamics, right? Not the static. So Roshan presented a static picture of how domestic savings and external balances corresponded. But if you convert that to a dynamic model, then you have to not only think about what domestic service external balance equation today, but what it does to tomorrow. Because the classic argument made by those who want to do it differently is that today's dissaving is tomorrow's growth. And if you offset the dissaving with growth, that you grow your way out of debt rather than starve your way out of debt, which is austerity. So the big debate, globally, is whether austerity measures or growth measures work better. And clearly, there are merits to both, right? So Sri Lanka has to decide how it straddles austerity and growth. And the argument made by the current sort of decision makers is that 2015 to 19 was, while we had a primary, so coming to Chandra's point, the primary account surplus or primary surplus in the budget, then it also killed growth. Now, I'm not agreeing with that view, but if it did, then that's an argument that the primary surplus didn't yield the benefits that you wanted to yield, because low growth also hurts your debt sustainability, right? So I think the economic analytical challenge we have is really to figure out not just, because the equation can be made to work in multiple ways when you work with a dynamic equation rather than a static equation. And the implications of your spending on growth is a critical dimension of that sustainability framework for economic recovery, and how you do the growth, right? So I think that's the only part I wanted to add to this question. That going forward in a solution to Sri Lanka's problems, we have to make assumptions about consequences to growth also. Now, Sri Lanka's additional problem is we don't also convert growth to government revenue. So it really helps if you can get growth and convert growth to government revenue, because then it solves the fiscal imbalance problem, and it also solves the debt sustainability problem at the same time. If you get one of those two things, it's not good enough. If you get growth without government revenue, you keep adding to the debt problem through the deficit. If you get revenue without growth, you keep adding to the debt sustainability problem because of low growth, right? Because the debt sustainability problem is finally an equation of the percentage of your GDP that you carry in debt, which is why Australia can run 100 years of deficits. As long as you're posting growths that are higher, you can pull that through. Chandra, when you are shaking your head, I wonder whether you're agreeing or disagreeing, but I want to, I'll stop my comments there. Chandra, you're on mute. Yeah, you're on mute.
Professor Advocata, you're on mute, but if I could ask you to hold on to your comments for a minute, and I'll get back to you. We have a question that's come in from the press, from Ruhana, who I believe is from MTV. With the prevailing situation in the country, how will Sri Lanka finance next year's budget deficit? The government is trying to finance its deficit through domestic sources and reduce its reliance on foreign debt. Is this practical, and how will this affect the local economy? Dr. Rajapatrana, would you mind if I direct that question to you? Dr. Rajapatrana, you're muted. 1 second.
Yeah, it's a very difficult question you have posed to me. Actually, I don't know. I mean, what are the areas in which they can increase revenue? I think the surefire, I would go the other way and say, revenue alone won't do it, in the sense that you can cut down wastage and the huge amount that are being lost on public enterprises, for example. We have to seek some assistance here also. For the if the public inflows can deal with some of the more prevalent problems outside maybe if the private sector is encouraged also, then there could be some sharing of it. But I would like to know what is this new money, increased money, going to be spent on? Are we going to have a repeat performance? So we can be very careful about where we are going to spend it. And not only raise the funds, I'm not sure how we are going to do it. I think there are maybe a couple of choices. The way that Nishan was also going towards that area. I'd say try to cut down the waste that you have in the system. And you have to increase your taxes. But on the other hand, that will have a bad adverse reaction on the economic growth. So it's an important balancing act, but I don't think that anybody had thought through it as yet. I have not read anything about it. So the budget is still out there. Maybe somebody will come out with a good solution. It's not me. I'm not going to be able to do it. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Rajapatrana. We have another comment that has come in on public sector reform, stating that the public sector in Sri Lanka is quite large, and reform in this area in the short term, is it possible without a sort of major shock to the overall economy? Professor Samarajiva, do you think I could hear your thoughts on this?
Sector. Let's see whether we can define our terms. So we have state-owned enterprises. That is, we have a significant number of people employed, and government-owned entities, state-owned entities that are causing all sorts of distortions in the economy. Public sector would be the people who are directly employed by government. I'm going to take it that the question is about the latter, that is the public sector. I think there is a possibility, because if you really look at how the COVID is impacting the people of this country, the informal sector is getting wiped out. They are unable to make a living, in fact, right? And unlike in other countries, we really haven't given them any compensation for the damage caused by the lockdowns. I'm not even saying this is charity or anything like that. I'm using specific terms, compensation for the losses caused to them by the lockdown, right? And second group that has got wiped out is small business. They're getting whacked, and they're getting attacked not on two counts. One is the COVID lockdowns, and the second is government policies. The government is going through a permit regime requiring excessive barriers to entry to imports and so on and so forth. That is also destroying the small guys. The big companies are doing okay. Maybe the top 1% or whatever, the classic golf club, swimming club members may be doing better. And the other group that is actually doing quite well, has not been affected, are the 1.4 million government employees. And now we have gone on for a year and also, more than a year, with them not coming to work, but their salaries being untouched. So what I would propose is that we come up with a scheme. Now remember, the formal private sector people took a hit. The trade unions and the employers got together and they decided that they were going to be paid 50% of their earnings. Right? So everybody took a hit except the government, the public sector employees. So what I would propose is the following. That is, we discuss this issue of how everybody is suffering, and we offer some of these people, particularly we look at the track record of who has been called to office and who has not been called to office, and we allow them to work from home, possibly without any time duration, for half their salaries. That is, there's no hope that they will be brought back. They're given half their salaries for the next 5 years. If necessary, we can even talk about some kind of voluntary packages for them to start a new business or something like that. The others who the experience has shown over the last 1.5 years are essential to the functioning of government, we tell them that there will be additional training packages and so on and so forth for them to become more productive, because I'm quite persuaded by Professor McMoor's argument that while we have a large government's large public sector of a lot of employees, we don't actually spend money on what they require to be productive. There's a whole argument that McMoor develops on this. If you look at an organization, a private sector organization, we know the cost of an employee is not what we pay them, but there's additional stuff. All the HR development costs, the training costs, the computers, the facilities that we use, and we can always make a calculation and say that is the cost of an employee. Now in the government, that cost of an employee is quite low. So we really need to drive that up, because we need to then give these people KPIs and tell them that if they don't increase their productivity, they will be joining their brethren and sisters at home on half salary. I think that is an opportunity that the COVID situation has offered us in terms of public sector reform, because I would conclude by saying that my experience in working in government has been that however much I try to be external oriented and do deliverables, think of my deliverables as those that are owed to the industry I'm regulating or the people I'm serving or whoever, the external actors, there's an incredible amount of demand for my energies, my time, my attention from the inside. About one group saying that their uniforms are of such and such quality and the other group is not getting the similar quality. So that can be reduced by these kinds of reforms. The last problem is that That's the one that I don't really have an answer for, which is at the top of all this are 22 sort of services led primarily by the Sri Lanka Administrative Service. And they will, of course, define themselves to be indispensable and essential, and they will shield themselves from all the cuts that we come up with. But in fact, they are a serious barrier to reform. So I've been involved in a couple of efforts trying to reform the administrative service. That one I'm somewhat at a loss about how to fix. I'm done.
Thank you, Professor Samrajiva. We have a question coming in from Amal Jayasinghe, a reporter with AFP. Dr. Roshan, if I could direct this to you, at the current rate of foreign exchange inflows and outflows, by when do you think Sri Lanka will be really stuck to meet its foreign debt obligations? What is the best case? What is the worst case?
I really don't know, because I don't know all the foreign inflows and outflows. But I think I alluded to this because I said that, I mean, if you look at today's gross official reserve position, we have something like 3.5 billion US dollars. But in the next 12 months of foreign liabilities are about 7 billion, and that's just in this next 12 months. But going forward, we have other obligations. So it just all depends on what kind of inflows we get. But the thing is, this has an impact on the sustainability and the stability, because the more and more we borrow, this whole problem is going to just get even worse. So it all depends on where our inflows are coming from. So as the Professor Perera get this kind of a like this Paris Club type arrangement, and we can get low concessional financing to meet our obligations, then we can maybe prolong this. But if we don't have access to this kind of low cost funding, the problem is going to get, and we're going to hit a brick wall very soon. So I don't have a exact answer, but basically we're not looking at there aren't too many options available to us.
Understood. There's a question that kind of deviates from what we've been talking about, but is quite important. Professor Suri Ratnapala, if I could direct this to you, there's a question to the panel from one of the journalists saying, what impact will the recent emergency regulations have on investor confidence? And I'm assuming they're referring to the emergency regulations that have been introduced since the start of the pandemic.
Okay. I wouldn't really know for sure. The declaration of the emergency and the emergency regulations have turned out to be very controversial. It doesn't send a very good signal overseas, I would think, that the country is in a stable situation and the government is in control. There are a few issues with this emergency. One is that once a declaration is made under the Public Security Ordinance, it triggers a vast amount of powers which are pretty untrammeled, that can be exercised by the president. So that also creates uncertainty for people who want to come and invest. The immediate impact of the emergency regulations can be easily seen. It destabilizes property rights, it destabilizes personal rights,
personal freedoms, and it solidifies the perception that the government would like to govern the country with more and more authoritarian power. So I can't see this as a very positive sign from the point of view of investors. It's up in the air now. I mean, people don't know what's going to happen, to what extent these emergency powers would be exercised. At the moment, it's on two fronts. One is preventing hoarding and government taking over the distribution of important commodities. And the other is to ensure that essential services are carried through. There's a lot of questions about the extent of these powers. So yeah, on the whole, I don't think it is very positive.
And to follow up on that, if I could ask Anarkali to weigh in here. The government has also been imposing a lot of ad hoc controls on foreign exchange, including mandatory conversion of foreign exchange. And as the crisis sort of worsens, the levels of control seem to be expanding. What sort of signal does this give to our investors, both local and foreign, as well as overseas banks, that we have to deal with, that we need to have contact and a decent relationship with for the purposes of not only investment, but also trade?
So I think it's not just for investors, it's anybody in any form of business right now, whether you're an export business or an import business, the government's controls have caused false markets, right? So you have, there's no certainty, and anybody will tell you, especially with foreign investors or even with local investors, if you're thinking about whether it's starting something new, continuing to invest in your businesses, just day-to-day transactions, that uncertainty is incredibly difficult to deal with. The currency fluctuations, or I don't know if this is controversial to say, but the lack of reality or the denial of the reality of where we're at with our exchange rate is extremely difficult, right? If your central bank is insisting to the banks in the country that they have to hold a rate, and that's not what's being transacted at, how do you determine your business decisions on a day-to-day basis, even? I mean, even if I was a foreign investor looking at our capital market, right, looking at investing into the Colombo stock market, I am converting my dollars to invest essentially in rupee shares. And I can't tell what that's going to be on a daily basis. I don't know what rate I'm going to do. How do I work out what my returns are? How do I work out whether I'm going to be allowed to take this currency out? So these restrictions, even in terms of restricting the outflows, are so damaging, because you can see there are large mutual funds that are, complaining about the fact that they have had to wait for months to take money out of our market when they have not done anything, while you have at the same time, we're trying to encourage FDI. We're trying to say, come and invest your money. We're open for business. We're ready to do this. So those conflicting messages and policies are very, very difficult to navigate. And I think the crisis has just made it significantly worse, but these conflicting policies, U-turns in policy that successive governments have done is one of the problems that we do face very low FDI in the country.
Thank you. Dr. Gamage, I see you've raised your hand. Would you like to jump in on this?
Actually, I'll wait because there's some questions on chat. Maybe I'll come after those. There are some questions on chat.
Brilliant.
So I'll come later.
Thank you. Mr. Murtaza, there are a few questions that have come in, and I'd like to combine one or two of them. So the first is whether there's been any study done on how much private dollar debt has to be paid in the next 5 years. And also combined with that, the question of what is the sovereign debt default risk for Sri Lanka and facing it now? And do you see that same risk in 2022? What is there a way out for the government?
So Anita, I've been speaking continuously last weekend. I was hoping that I didn't have to speak, that I would just sit and observe. I will quickly try to answer those questions, but I do have a question that I would like to put to Professor Ratnapala and Professor Rohan Samarajiva and whoever else wants to weigh in, which is the issue of economic governance and what their thoughts are, because Sri Lanka seems to be getting into problems. So there is an issue of governance, especially economic governance. And as you know, Advocata did submit a recommendation to the new Constitutional Committee about changes in the economic governance framework. So I would like to have their comments, because they are professors of law, about how this can be addressed, because ultimately we have to convince the markets that, you know, after this, that this is not going to happen again, that we are going to go on a sustainable path. In answering these questions about the sovereign default risk and how much we have to pay, I don't have an exact answer, but I can tell you this. My computation is about $37 billion of our debt is dollar denominated. Not all of it is owned by non-residents. Some of it is owned by residents. From the Sri Lanka development bonds, about $2 billion is owned by our banks. And from the international sovereign bonds, there is about 1.9 billion. Besides the banks, there are non-bank entities also holding. So you can assume that about $4.5 billion is being held by residents. The rest is owned by foreigners. But about $37 billion or more is dollar denominated. Then the question is that what will happen over the next 5 years? The average term to maturity of our foreign debt is also around 5 years. Right? Some of the debt is over a very long period of time that we have got from the ADB and the World Bank. The average is about 5 years. Some of our international sovereign bonds only mature in 2029, 2030. So there are different maturities. But I did a presentation on Friday where the slide deck basically showed that over the next 4 to 5 years, there's about $4.5 billion of maturities coming up. These are for market instruments. There are lots of term loans and other forms also that need to be paid. Now, what's going to happen in the short term? We know we have $3.5 billion worth of reserves. Predetermined drains on reserves is already calculated by the central bank. It is about 6.95 billion. That's why Roshan said 7 billion. In the month of August, in the next 1 month, I mean, that is computed at the end of July, $250 million is their estimate. That must have already gone because we're in September. Then they show another bucket between 2 and 3 months. In that bucket, 1.45 billion is going. So from the 3.5, if you assume 1.45 billion US dollars is going, you're left with 2 billion. Then there are some other swaps like the Chinese swap, which is calculated at $1.5 billion. My understanding is a yuan swap. So it can't be really converted into US dollars. It comes at a fairly high level. I doubt they can use that for debt service payments. So now the crisis is quite literally here. I mean, you can't wait till you get to the bottom of the barrel to default. So any sensible person will say that, okay, we need to reprofile the debt, which means that we'll have to freeze debt payments for quite a few years, giving us time to recover. So when this is going to happen is any man's guess, but I would say it can be between now and maximum they can hold on for 1 year if they wait to empty the barrel completely. Okay, so I don't know when, but they can't last too long because, as we said, that there's $6.7 billion to go from the end of August to 11 months from that day. And even if you get swaps, and even if you take the deficit of the current account, you're going to run out of money. Can I, Anita, put my question about the case of economic governance to the two professors, starting with you, Professor Ratnapala?
Of course, Mr. Murtaza.
All right. Okay. Yeah, I mean, we might have different ideas about what economic governance actually means. From my point of view, it is the institutional strength that is required to make the economy prosper over the medium and long term. What I see is that it's a general problem of governance, not simply economic, but economy obviously depends very much on it. The first thing I can say is that we've got to rebuild the institutions of government, the judiciary, the law enforcement agencies, police, the auxiliary organizations that support the legal system, the quality of the legal profession, property rights have to be strengthened, and definitely the point that came up in the presentation that the title to land has got to be reformed, has got to be stabilized. The World Bank produced a report a few years back about land titling. And if you don't have that land titling, we're not going to, the country cannot actually benefit. And I'm not talking about just the big companies who want to invest in land development and that sort of thing. I'm talking about the villager, the small investor, the tradesman who cannot raise money, who cannot invest with courage because they do not have title to their land, and they cannot. So that's an enormous sector where where law reform needs to be done, and the elephant in the room is really corruption. If you do not address that, corruption erodes all institutions, and the only way you can address the problem is from the very top. There is no acknowledgement on the part of the leaders of government that there is a problem with corruption. The first thing is to acknowledge that there is corruption, and then secondly, they need to give leadership themselves to restraining corruption by their own conduct and behavior and the norms that they adopt for themselves. If they don't do that, then you cannot expect corruption to be restrained at the lower levels. And what I'm going to say is this: there's the most important reform that I can think of is, or the two reforms which are interconnected, is reduction of corruption and the strengthening of the vital institutions that support the economy. Now, this is costless. You don't need money to reduce corruption. You don't need money to improve the legal system. So it's an absolute. You don't need people to come and tell you that it's something to be done. You don't need even the World Bank to tell you that, and it doesn't cost anything. It might cost some people's private incomes, but it does not cost the economy anything. And you will see the very fact of letting the world know that you're serious about it, I feel would make a difference to investment, both locally and internationally. So on the specifics, I can talk for a long time, but those are my basic ideas about what I consider is the economic constitution.
I was worried that I wouldn't have anything to say, but I do. What I would do in the short term is that I think we'll have to start from a understanding that we are in a war situation, in the same way that Great Britain faced the challenges of the Second World War, and they created a national government. I think we need to do that with a common minimum program. And one of the things that an organization that I am associated with, the Sadharana Samajak Sandhavu Jatika Vyapare, we are developing such a common program. One of the things that I would include in this common program is not trying to solve all the problems, but to identify the key sectors. So what I would see is utilities or infrastructure, trade, things like that, say the port city. Key areas that would make a huge difference to the functioning of the economy, where confidence has to be built. Confidence. That's the key point, confidence. How do you create confidence is the issue. So that is what you do, plus how do you deal with perception. So within that context, we would also need to bring back parts of the 19th Amendment, that is especially those regarding independent commissions and due process. The things that were stripped out by the 19th Amendment. I don't know how we can work with the current 19th Amendment, the 20th Amendment. So we have an agreement that these particular areas, for example, the Public Utilities Commission, the Port City Commission, etc., would have to have consensus from the national government, that is all the political parties, subject to these the common minimum program, and we'll have to make appointments to them, new appointments. And in there, I think it would be important to essentially reach outside the country, either to expatriate Sri Lankans or to, now here I'm most of, all this is mine, I haven't got it approved by anybody. We'll have to get either foreigners or expatriate Sri Lankans to head these, because they'll have to take certain actions that will truly demonstrate that they are independent. So in the same way that Singapore, for example, despite all their claims of good governance and so on, because they had Singtel as the regulated entity, the telecom regulator, they appointed an American, because they said that guy is not going to be playing by Singapore inside whatever the Singapore club rules. He'll be outside. Hong Kong for several years had foreigners as the telecom regulators. I think more than 10 years in the early stages. I knew these guys, Alex Serena and so on and so forth, right? So they did that for perception reasons, because you had to address the perceptions of the investors. So in the same way, I was very disturbed that the opportunity that was first laid out, that for the Port City Commission, foreigners would be recruited through international advertising, was then pulled back because of this garbage, false nationalistic rhetoric. So I think that we'll have to identify a segment of the economy, and we'll have to push through the reforms. But this will have to be coupled, I want to emphasize, it will have to be coupled with a very strong targeted compensation scheme for the people who are affected. So for example, if we are going to have world market fuel prices, you're going to have knock-on effects right through electricity tariffs, through water tariffs, all that. It's going to have an impact. So we have to safeguard the people who are most hurt by those things. And particularly with regard to water, I think the mechanisms are there to help them. We need to have targeted programs to safeguard them. That's my answer. Mine is very tied up with the COVID situation, not a generalizable solution.
Anita, can I jump in and ask Dr. Rajapatirana also to comment, because once upon a time he was working closely inside government, whether he can reflect on his experience and whether he has any reflections about how to improve economic governance without getting into specifics for obvious reasons.
Of course, Mr. Murtaza. Dr. Rajapatirana, over to you.
Fine. Is that okay? Right. Yeah, okay. So that's, Murtaza, it's a difficult question. I found a couple of things that are there in the place that I work. There were few very competent people and many who didn't know what was going on. So when I would begin by looking at the talent we have in the system and allow the people whom you think are not going to measure up to the challenges of dealing with all these things that we are discussing today, give them a good handshake and reduce stuff. We don't need 1.4 million people, and it's one of the highest rates of public service employment. I suppose in Asia or probably other parts of the world. I have had the benefit of visiting many country governments over the years, last 30 years. And I have met all of them are very, very competent people, very competent. We also had competent people in the past, but they seem to have really declining quality. And so I would not go with the 1.4 million. I would say try to fix the best people and have a system of appointments that we had in the past, public service commission type of appointment. And unfortunately, after I think it's 1972, some of the independence of those institutions were done away with, and now ministers can hire the people they want. That wasn't the case before. So therefore, the quality can be addressed by improving the recruitment and have a reintroduce public service commission, people who are independent who can assess people, and also training that is missing. A lot of training, a lot of people. For example, if you saw during the COVID when we were getting vaccinations, I know people were struggling to deal with their computers to download the names and things of people who were able to get this thing. So I discovered a very sort of a bottleneck there. A lot of people, I stood in a queue for 4 hours standing. And so that is because there was a real bottleneck. So I would say I would teach English so that they can have a very good understanding of what is happening in the rest of the world. I teach them information technology to deal with day-to-day problems. And I have met over the years many people from the World Bank and IMF who had come on missions to this country. And they come and give me a very a pessimistic outlook, because most of the people who were who worked with them in the past were no longer there, retired, but the replacement has not been very good. So I would say reduce the size of the public service in a very rational way, giving them good compensation to leave, and have a training program. And we have a administrative school of where it trains people to bring them up to date with modern thinking. Something, for example, I used to teach project evaluation there long years ago. And so I think there should be a quality improvement. And if I may go back to the land thing that were discussed, actually you offered under the MCC program to do cadastral surveys and things. And so many people who come here to interested in investing in Sri Lanka run into the bottleneck of land, how to get access to land in order to do not only agriculture but other things also, large factories and things. So I think that I would make a list of the things that are holding us back, particularly on FDI, improve the quality of our public servants, and also, as I think suggested to bring them up to date on the use of information technology. That's not very specific. I'm sorry, but that's what I can say.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rajpatrana. Dr. Roshan, we've had some questions from Ranga Srilal from BBC Sinhala. So it's a two-part question. The first is that given the strict import restrictions and low interest rate regime, how is the excessive money printing going to impact the economy? And the second question is that the panel the discussion has been around that the only solution is the IMF. But the conditions put forward by the IMF, such as selling state-owned enterprises like Sri Lankan Airlines, CEB, CPC, how do you justify those decisions? Yes, for example, Sri Lankan Airlines is loss-making, but it brings in tourists into the country that in turn generates jobs and revenue. If I could direct those two questions to you.
Thank you, Anita. Firstly, I'd like to say that it's not a matter of whether it's IMF or not IMF. I think as a country we have to take responsibility for our future. So any policy package really has to be our policy package. The IMF is only a facilitator, really, as a lot of people mentioned, particularly because of our debt situation. We might have to have some debt. They kind of act like the neutral umpire, because you are going to be dealing with many stakeholders, and it's the same in the banking system in Sri Lanka. If there is a debt restructuring, the central bank will have to step in as a neutral umpire. It will have to handle the debt restructuring or bank restructuring, like this current debt moratorium or the debt restructuring that may make. So in the same way, in terms of a country, the IMF is merely will act as a neutral umpire. The other reason why you get an institution like the IMF is because of the experience. I mean, they have people who have worked in many countries that have faced similar problems. I mean, the problems that we are facing are not new. I mean, there are many countries that have faced similar problems. So they have experience in working and helping countries work through these problems and come out of the problem. So I think that's the reason for the IMF. But I think we need to take responsibility for what needs to happen. So we can't just keep saying, oh, it's the IMF and blame the IMF. The country as a whole needs to take responsibility. Regarding some of the policy programs that are implemented, and I think he mentioned something like about the SOEs, reform of SOEs for an example. I mean, it's not just a matter of selling SOEs. A whole menu of options, whole range of options that are available to deal with SOEs. The thing is that we need to understand we can't continue this kind of inefficient. We can't continue to have this kind of inefficiencies in a country. I mean, some of these SOEs are the largest institutions or largest entities operating in this country. So any inefficiency in that entity feeds through the rest of the economy, because they are inputs into a lot of our industries and services. So any inefficiency in those institutions will feed through into the rest of the economy. That is why we need to address the SOEs through reform. So it's not just only selling. I mean, you have to basically improve competition. You have to improve the competitiveness of the. And I think Professor Samarjeeva has very good experience of that in terms of our telecom sector. I mean, how did we improve that? How did that become such a vibrant sector? Is because we introduced and loved competition. But that may not be the only way to address some of these. So I think we have to look at this holistically. I have to say that none of these prescriptions or none of these policies are new. We have talked about this ad nauseum, I mean, for years. But it's a matter of the political will to actually do them. And I think now we have kind of hit a brick wall. We need to come together, and I agree with Professor Samarajiva. We need to come together as a whole, as an entire country, and help with this restructuring. I don't think our problems are insurmountable. We have a very small country in a sense. Our problems are actually much smaller compared to many of even our neighboring countries. But it's a matter of the will, political will, and also of our citizens. Or for our citizens, we too need to take responsibility. We need to understand what needs to be done and come together to do that. I'll keep it at that.
Thank you, Dr. Roshan. Dr. Gambage, I see you've raised your hand. There's also a question that in the chat box that I'd like to post to you, but if you have a comment, please go ahead.
What's the question, Anita?
The question that has come in is that so Sri Lanka has suffered a continuous outflow of skilled people since the 1950s that continues today. It has also been claimed that there is a mismatch in skills between the output of the education system and the needs of the economy. How important is addressing this problem in the context of recovery from the pandemic, and how does a country go about it?
Okay, that's good, actually. That's a good way to sort of start what I was going to say. That's a very technical question. There's a skills mismatch, but I think the important thing is to ask is, what is it to be educated? What are we trying to match? How do we know what to match? So I think we need to just focus on the supply side and say, okay, there's education, and what is the purpose of education? And the purpose of education would be to educate people. So what is it to be educated? I think there's a really good conversation going on right now about what it is to be educated, because parents are getting to see what education consists of. They can see piles and piles of information coming into their smartphones, and they're beginning to ask, is this education? So I think that brings me to what I was going to say. We have come up with specific proposals, on the immediate side, the debt restructuring and kind of things like that. Then if you look at the specific proposals we have here, they're actually very, in some ways, long-term. See, the business environment, land supply, labor markets, those things are actually, they may not cost much, but these are sort of long-term benefits, takes time. If you take human capital and infrastructure, these are deficit spending. We have to spend to get there. So I think what we need is, we need something emotional on top of this to drive all this. We have to ask ourselves, what is quality? What does it mean to serve in government? What does it mean to be educated? I think we have to, if we start some kind of emotional, cultural questions like that, I know who's going to ask those, maybe not Advocata, maybe Advocata. On top of the economic things, we need to ask for these cultural, emotional issues, which really, I think, are going to drive some of these things we want to do, the doing business environment, all this. If you ask God, what is quality? What is to be educated? What is to be educated? Is it to collect credentials, collect paper? Or, there's a nice definition by UNICEF, what is to be educated? Critical thinking, personality, intrapersonal. Interpersonal is how we deal with others, citizenship, and multiliteracy. I mean, if we start begin the conversation, what is it to be educated and something like that, I think some of these things will start moving. Without that cultural, emotional thing to drive it, all these are little cogs that will just be stuck. So I think we need that kind of conversation. What is quality? What is it to be educated? It needs to, I think that will be the loosening thing that will drive it. That's what I have to say.
Thank you, Dr. Gamge. There is a follow-up question from Ranga from BBC Singhal that I'd like to just open up to the panel in general. That was, given the strict import restrictions and low interest rate regime, how does excessive money printing impact the economy? If anyone in the panel would like to jump on that question.
Shall I, Anita?
Thank you, Dr.
Anita, yeah. I think the first thing is I used to be, last incarnation, I worked in central bank for 10 years. And when I left, I was the head of money and banking research. So I used my old knowledge of this there. Now, I think first we have to get a very clear reckoning of what is the amount of that is money being printed, and make it relate to the inflation rate that we have now agreed is about 6%. To me, as a economist who have looked at these things in the past, I find a lot of discord between the figures cited for money creation and the inflation rate that is reported from the press and reported from government sources. So first, to get a very clear reckoning what are the nature of the problem we have. It is one of the things about the inflation is that it doesn't go regularly like 4%, 3%. It may go 4%, 3%, and jump to 10 to 15 to 150%. I have seen countries, I remember I was in Argentina for language training. When I entered the country, it was 300 pesos to the dollar. By the time I finished my 1 month program, it was over 900. And my teachers didn't have money to come to teach me, and I subsidized them and said, please do come. Here's the fee for this is your bus fare. So in other words, we are in a very dangerous situation now about it with money. Very dangerous situation. We have to have again the Ministry of Finance, the central bank, the best authority people we have knowledgeable in the country get together and work out and have a workout. How are you going to deal with the excess money that is floating around that some may have not even emerged yet? It's a very dangerous thing to have, because if you have very high inflation, that is the worst thing you can do to the poor people. That is the most unkind tax you can have about high inflation. And also that people now are writing about this, not necessarily in Sri Lanka, that since inflation does not happen exactly the same proportion to every sector and to every industry and a commercial venture, it reallocates resources in a way that is not very helpful for growth for the country as a whole. So I would say have a very good reckoning of what we are dealing with. Let the central bank and the Ministry of Finance and us, independent thinkers look at it. What is going to happen when we have this, on top of it, import restrictions. Import restrictions anyway raise prices. So the money sloshing going about in the system helps to keep it up, the prices going up again. So I think that has a very serious problem that we have to get together and work out. Get the central bank, the Ministry of Finance, independent institutions, look at it together and say, what are we going to do? And maybe it's the time to, before the budget, we think about next year's budget, have some understanding of what we are going to do. That's what I can say. I mean, we can ask the IMF to help again. They have experience. One thing I want to say before I stop, IMF is not are people very helpful. In the central bank, I work with them directly, and I have worked with them in other parts of the world. They have a system in which, as it was mentioned before, they have a lot of experience. There are people who want to help you. I mean, they are not this. Sometimes they have to say things that we don't want to hear, but we hear straight the truth from them. They have no interest. They are not pushing any party line. They dealt with these things over the last 70 years. There's a very good human capital there that can help us. And so I would say, bring them in. You don't have to get a loan from, you don't have to have a program. You can still, you can have a technical program. You can invite them, have seminars with them, and they will come. I know many of them have gone to cabinet meetings and said, this is the problem, this is how our advice for you to do it. Let's get together and do it. And so we will have credibility. So my last comment, and I stop here. Even if you do a perfect IMF-like program, let's say we are doing exactly the IMF program, reduce in demand, all that, still we won't be as credible as having IMF program, because we are the, you know, it has a good housekeeping seal to have them there. And they say these are same bunch of guys that got into trouble. So let's look at it fresh. So that's my thing. Don't be shy, go there and invite them to give a technical assistance.
Thank you, Dr. Rajpatrana. Professor Sirimal Aberatna, thank you for joining us. I believe you also want to jump in on this. And Anarkali, I'll take your comment next afterwards. Professor Aberatna, over to you.
Thank you. The question about printing money and the exchange rate and the inflation. If there is a channel mechanism, channeling process of the effects, how the effects of money printing are transmitted to those two areas, foreign exchange market as well as inflation. And if that channeling process is working smoothly, you would see the effects of money printing on these two areas. However, we should also know that crisis time, the link between money and inflation gets weaker during the crisis time. That's why the whole world started printing money during the last 10 years. And Sri Lanka also jumped into the same wagon. Now, however, it has a limit to go even during crisis time. Even during crisis time, it has a limit. And the money printing and exchange rate depreciation, these two are also linked. That's why money printing cannot go on without limiting imports. So import restrictions should come in too. Now, actually, that link is getting stronger again. The link between money printing and inflation. So that's why the central bank also took some measures in the reverse direction a couple of weeks ago. And it has also happened in some other countries as well, because in the world now we see the aggregate demand is getting heated. And there are signs of inflationary pressure building up in the world economy and in Sri Lanka too. Given the world price trends as well as given the local issues that are at work, and we can also see the inflationary pressure is building up, so that in fact the money printing cannot go on without limits, and I think that we have come to those limits.
Thank you, Professor. Anarkali, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, I just, listening to the panel and all the eminent speakers we have here, right? It brings to mind, the saying that you shouldn't waste a good crisis, right? We are in that place right now. And, just the points that the panel has made from looking at transparency, good governance, strengthening the institutions, targeting our infrastructure, really looking at the fact that we live in the 21st century in the digital age, right? If you look at the last crisis that didn't so much impact Sri Lanka, but was, the global financial crisis, there are many things that changed in the rest of the world. And there was success stories that came out of that as well, right? And I think maybe for us, the positive is that we have now been pushed to this extent that we have to take a good, hard look. And as Dr. Perera pointed out, it's not just at the feet of the government, right? It's all of us holistically as a nation has to look at this and say, right, this is going to be hard and this is the medicine we have to take, but there are also many positives that could come out of it long term. And I do hope that, that there's strong takeaways from today. Thank you.
Thank you. If I could just follow up on that, we've had a comment on Facebook that says that, while appreciating, macroeconomic analysis, the problem is that the state is not a rational actor. In a country such as ours, where politics drives decision making, should we be focusing more on the political economy and feasibility, essentially, of these reforms? Anarkali, could I get you to weigh in on that?
I'm not sure I'm the best qualified to weigh in on that. I think maybe Professor Ratnapala or maybe even Murtaza can weigh in better than I could. I do understand where the person is coming from, that the political will needs to be strong for any of this to happen, from cutting back in terms of the public sector to any of the reforms that everyone has spoken about. I understand that, and I understand, where they're going at, where they're getting at, but I think I'm going to have to ask one of the other members of the panel to jump in.
Let me say something, Anita. I think, the statement, a good crisis should never be allowed to go waste, isn't only said by the people that we agree with, people who think like us. It is also thought of, it is also being implemented by people like Dr. Anuruddha Padeniya, who's the principal economic advisor of the government. He's a doctor, a pediatrician. So these people have a vision of a country that is rural-based, where every family makes its own coconut oil using a sekkua and things of that nature, and uses local medicines, even though he's a Western-trained doctor. So they've got a vision. So for us, when we look at the fertilizer ban, it sort of seems like insane. Doesn't make any sense in our world. But in fact, these are active efforts to decouple Sri Lanka from the global market, from the global economy. And given the kind of emptiness of the politicians in charge, these advisors to the politicians are trying to recreate some picture that they have in their head about a idyllic Sri Lanka. I mean, he actually says that before all this Western mumbo jumbo happened, quoting Pliny the Elder, I believe, as his source, people used to live for 140 years in Sri Lanka, that their longevity was much more than anywhere else in the world. Pliny the Elder, I think you should look up the rest of the stuff that Pliny the Elder talked about. He talked about people who use their feet as to shelter from the rain and things of that nature. Completely fantastic, fantabulous stuff. But this is the belief system that these people are in. And they are actively, you see, it doesn't make sense to people with our worldview, but if you try to get into that worldview, you see a certain picture emerging of a country that does not import its food, that is more connected to the land and things of that nature. So that is how this crisis is being used. I think we need to keep that in mind in terms of a political economic analysis.
Can I just add something to that, Anita?
Of course, Dr. Damage, go ahead.
Yes, yeah, that's what I like to get back to what I said. We need to engage the idea space, because all these all these ideas, all these recommendations, who's going to bell the cat? And the cat is not just the government, just the authorities. The cat is the people, the big cat, all these things have to be internalized somehow. People have to feel that these are important. So I think we really need to, while we are going on with these economic reform proposals, we need to keep our eyes on the idea space. And as I said, we are beginning to see, focusing on children and what they're learning is one such idea space that we're working, but we need to find some other idea spaces that we need to intervene at the same time, but keep our eyes open for those. Okay.
Thank you.
Can I also come in, please?
Of course, Professor Advocata, go ahead.
Yes. Well, given the term political win, it can be based on some people's fantasy, hypothetical ideas, hypothetical status of dreams, and then work on that. Or it can also be based on just political decisions and ignoring the professional side of all these economic decisions, and politics can replace professionalism as well. So given these things, I think the crisis has deepened in this country. But however, if we take another look at what we are experiencing right now and what we are trying to understand the way forward, we are looking for short-term solutions for a long-term fundamental issue. And what is our long-term fundamental issue is that we haven't put the economy on track over a long period of time, so that we have seen for 20-25 years that the economy was getting slowed down. And it is not, to my understanding, it is not the COVID issue. And in fact, economic recovery for Sri Lanka doesn't mean that we are going back to the pre-pandemic situation. And in fact, we have to go beyond that. And why we didn't go beyond that in the past, that is the reason why we are here today. So that I think Sri Lanka needs some bitter policy doses at this level to get the economy back on track, not only for recovery, but also get it on the track. In fact, according to the international data reports, I have seen many other related issues related to international trade, related to law and order, rule of law, and public sector efficiency in all these areas. And we haven't touched policy reforms for over 20 years, for which we are paying right now. And we are looking for short-term solutions for a long-term problem. Thanks.
Thank you. Professor Advocata, if I could direct the next question to you. This has come to us from someone on Facebook. How are we going to bring down the current account deficit by liberalizing imports? Does this not worsen the current leakage, mainly in the short term? If you could tackle that. Professor, you're muted. If you could unmute and make your point. Yes.
In other words, this person asked whether quantitative import restrictions are needed to solve the current account problem, right? You can say naturally, I mean, you don't need economics to understand when you impose restrictions, naturally imports will come down. But the medium to long term implication for current account position can be entirely opposite of it, right? And then when import restrictions are imposed, firstly, export-oriented production is going to be affected mainly because most of the export industries rely on imported inputs. It is true that currently there's a duty rebate scheme introduced to help exporters, but there is a huge admin cost involved in getting entitlement for duty rebate scheme. And again, when it comes to global manufacturing trade, now this old idea of producing things from the beginning to end, even given country, using your own resources and then exported, is becoming irrelevant, mainly because of the phenomena what I call global production sharing. Countries specialize in different segments in the production process. Say hand phone is not produced in China, right? Hand phone is assembled in China by importing components from other countries. Therefore, if you want to get into this dynamic area of export specialization, you need to have imports. Imports are other side of the coin to exporting. Then again, when incentive structure get skewed toward protected industries, naturally, the profitability of export production diminishes. Think about some cases in my example. One of the success case was Munch biscuit. Because of import liberalization, it became very efficient. And shoe industry, not shoe, various other biscuits and other industry. Now these industries, bicycle export in India, asking for protection because the life is easy under protection, right? And then, but eventually, country is going to suffer when export-oriented industries become domestic market-oriented industries. Therefore, no country in the world has achieved balance of payment adjustment on a sustainable basis. If the person who asked the question can give me one simple example, I would be happy. Any single country which has achieved sustainable balance of payment position by importing import controls. Anita, if you can give me a minute, I want to make one point relating to this inflation issue talked about by Sirimal and others. Say, people who talk about money printing quote the modern monetary theory. This lady called Stephanie Kelton popularized this idea. She wrote an important book. You can see it, it's in my collection. She published the book, wrote the book with a very important qualification. She said, what I write in this book is relevant only for developed countries whose money is internationally traded, like Australia, America, and so on. But we are talking about this tiny Sri Lanka. I mean, our rupee is not used by any person in other countries, right? Therefore, eventually, when you inject money to the country, this is something they have ignored. Eventually, the balance of payment position is going to become worsened. Because of the inflationary pressure and the impact on the exchange rate and other related variables, eventually the balance of payment position is going to be even more worsened under money printing. This book has been written with that example, but maybe our people have not understood or they want to deceive the listeners. They say that money printing is not going to create a problem. Just one point about IMF conditionality. In Sri Lankan policy debate, there is this myth that IMF prescription conditionality is always costly to the country. Now, I have written a paper which will be coming out somewhere in Daily FT soon. I studied the 17 agreements we have signed with the IMF. Out of them, about 5 agreements were not fully implemented. In the case of all other agreements, our growth rate had been positive and significantly different from the average growth rate. Again, this allegation that IMF dictate conditionality is entirely wrong. Our people have the ability to negotiate, and IMF has the flexibility. I want to quote from Dr. Untitled Perera, the Trotskyite finance minister, who was the finance minister in the US government in the 70s. See what he has written. The government's effort to put its house in order is not the result of IMF advice, but it is in the obvious thing to do in the national interest. He agreed into 2 IMF agreements. His policies went wrong, but he understood the importance of IMF conditionality in managing macroeconomy. Actually, as part of his 1970 budget speech, he published all the previous letters of intent and then openly said the MPs, nowadays I think MPs can't understand this thing in our parliament. At that time, he categorically said that these documents have an important academic value. You have to understand how to get the macroeconomic house in order. He was intelligent with double PhD from LSE, not like the previous people who run the country. And he understood the importance of IMF. And even though his policies were not that good, he had the ability to negotiate with IMF. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. Professor Samarajiva, I believe you've had your hand raised for a minute. I'll give the mic over to you and then over to Mr. Murtaza.
Yeah, briefly on the question of import restrictions. I think what everybody has to understand is that 60% of our imports are for intermediate products, 20% for investment goods, and 20% for consumer goods. Import restriction, particularly as implemented by this government, is creating a lot of opportunities for permit holders and cronies to make money. So the consumer and the industrialists will be paying more without question. And because of that, their demand of these items will go down, which is also desirable from the perspective of the government. But instead of it being done efficiently, it will be done inefficiently, where the permit guys, the permit Raj, will benefit. And this is not, even when there are no permits, there will be people who will, just to give an example, the current controversial gazette that is requiring 100% deposit, minimum deposit on invoices, is basically knocking out all the small importers who will not be able to afford the minimum deposit and all those very harsh conditions, and will leave us with a few importers who have deep pockets. And in those oligopolistic conditions, they will raise the prices, but they will also add supranormal profits on top, because they are now oligopolistic and they'll be able to control the market. So I think we need to really think about import restriction also in that way. I'm complimenting, I'm not disagreeing with anything that Chandra said, but I'm complementing it, saying that what we are building is a kleptocracy, which will then pollute and completely distort the political processes of this country from this point onwards. Not that they weren't polluted enough, but this will aggravate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Murtaza, over to you.
So let me come into a subject matter that, eminent academics like Professor Advocata, etc., who have commented on this. Roshan, slide 3 is probably the most important slide to understand this whole trade issue about this national income and the savings balances in the country. So if you think about an economy that has $100 in it, and you allow all the people in the economy to compete for who gets the $100, the $100, the exchange rate will be a price, right? So the people who want, some part of that $100, a few dollars are going to bid up the price. So that's what determines the exchange rate. Now we are confusing making things in Sri Lanka with this limited amount of exchange that we have in the country. And therefore, basically, as no less a person than Professor Robert Lawrence from the Kennedy School of Government explained, Sri Lanka has a spending problem, right? Ours is a spending problem. It is not a trade policy problem. So very clearly, as Roshan slide 3 shows, there is excess absorption in the economy, which means there's too much of consumption, there's too much of investment. And as I tried to show in my presentation on Friday, it either can come from fiscal policy, either you are not taxing the people sufficiently so that they have excess amount of disposable income and therefore they're spending, or the government is not collecting sufficient revenue via taxation and spending through borrowing. The other problem where spending comes is through monetary policy, where you don't have sufficiently high enough real interest rates to incentivize households and firms not to spend. That means you save to keep for a future spending, or basically you're encouraging them to borrow and spend. So that's the crux of the problem, right? It has nothing to do with trade policy. We have too much of spending. So when you have excess amount of spending, you need to fund this spending, which is what comes to the current account balance, through foreign borrowing. That is where the foreign liabilities got created in the first place. So as they were trying to explain earlier, that most of the negative savings in the country is coming from the fisc, it's not coming from private households. So if we are to fix these recurring problems 16 times to the IMF, we have to fix this spending problem. And the only way to fix this spending problem is through higher taxation, in my opinion. And until 2019, we had very high real interest rates. So I don't think it was the failure of monetary policy. In fact, monetary policy was a great success in Sri Lanka in that last decade, at least going by the real interest rates. Okay. So then we come to the problem of about our trade policy, whether we should export more, whether we should make more things in Sri Lanka. Now all that does is to increase the economic activity in the economy. So how you grow the economy is by producing more. Now the question is, what do you produce? Do you produce what you need or what the rest of the world needs? I think that is the crux of Dr. Atukorale's argument, that you can add a little bit of value on a large pond. That will be a sizable amount for your economy. So our people get caught up about the proportion of value addition. What really matters is absolute amount of value addition. So I'll give you an example, right? People who say there are mineral sands in Sri Lanka on the east coast, the black color sea sand. So our people basically believe that no, you must add value to that mineral sand. You cannot export the mineral sand. Yeah. Mineral sand, basically, you get titanium dioxide out of mineral sand. Titanium dioxide is a root material that goes into paint. That's the thing that makes it white. Now, extracting titanium dioxide out of mineral sand is a long process with a lot of inputs, with a lot of pollution, including cyanide. Okay. So that's a completely different industry. And I remember a short period I went for some of these courses at the Kennedy School of Government, and they were showing, oil refineries are not where the oil is found. Oil refineries are closer to the mud. Yeah. So I think somewhere down the road, we need to have a master class about this absorption problem in the economy. And I'll just go on a little bit. Now, there are lots of people, intelligent people, educated people who say, what nonsense are you talking? They look at golf face and say, look at all those tall buildings. That's a sign of development. And I asked them, hey, 80% of that is all imported. So basically, this is again an absorption problem. You gave tax incentives to build tall buildings. You gave duty-free to build tall buildings. And your citizens were buying these tall buildings with very expensive apartments, basically. That is an example of excess spending. Okay. So what we should have been doing is we should have been appropriately taxing it so that there is no tax subsidy below other things. So we tax cars at 200%. we tax fuel at 20%. And at the moment, diesel is being sold below the world market CIF price. That's our biggest import. So that is where all these imbalances are coming. And for the benefit of the journalists out here, because for once and for all, we have to debunk this nonsense that basically we need import control and that we need to restrict imports because we have a current account deficit. That is not the root cause. And Professor Robert Lawrence, when he came to Sri Lanka, he gave a presentation, 2 videos, which Advocata has. Why trade? Why protect? Very simply, he explains this whole thing. Why trade? Why protect? And I believe Advocata is trying to convert this into Sinhala and explaining. Maybe Professor Adhukorale can help us do this. I don't know. I mean, do you agree with me, Professor, my argument? You'll have to unmute.
Sir, you're muted.
Processing of raw material. Can I give 1 or 2 examples? Say, Vietnam produce oil, but Vietnam does not process oil. They export it to Singapore simply because it is much cheaper for them to get it processed in the, Singapore and import oil back to Vietnam. That communist government, they have understood this problem. I remember once when I was doing a study for the Export Development Board in the 1980s. At that time, Export Development Board was a very strong organization. Dr. Santia Pillai was the chairman. I did a study about export grant scheme. Then when I look at the list of products in the export grant scheme, the first item was human hair. And incentives were given at 10%. At the bottom was a company producing plastic figurine for Walt Disney. It was given 1% incentives. Then I asked the Export Development Board people, why is this discrimination? They laughed at me. Can't you see that human hair exporters value addition is 95%? It is true. He is collecting human hair from barbershop, pack in plastic bag and export to Korea for some reason, right? Then I asked him how many bags of hair this guy is exporting. He employs only his wife at the company. And value addition to the country is nothing, right? Employing only 2 people. That electronic figurine company employing 400 workers, even though value added is 10%, it is adding a lot, more than million to national income. But people at EDB had not understood it. Dr. Santia Pillai thanked me for illustrating this point. This myth is pervading Sri Lankan policy scene. The most abused word in central bank report is value added. We have to think about not per unit value added, as Mr. Jafiji mentioned, total value added. Look at China, per unit value added of an Apple product is less than 7%. But Apple assembly factories employ 1.3 million people, and total addition to national income is many billions, right? Therefore, in this world of global production sharing, focusing on value added and primary processing in the country is not the way to go. I think this is the most abused concept in this country. Thank you.
And I would like to further add, you take the example of some of these local industries, right? Yeah. In the name of protecting local industry, they have had very high border tariffs, 50%, 75%. Yeah. Now, what happens is that they are so inefficient because they have the wrong source of power or fuel or whatever. If you take the cost of the direct imports and the indirect imports, basically the import cost probably is going to be higher than importing the finished goods. And because of the tariff protection, these people enjoy very high profit margins. Now, if they took those profit margins and kept it in the bank so that somebody else can use that profit for reinvestment, it's fine. But then they go and buy Rolls Royces and Ferraris and other things, which is also then imported. So if you basically take all the consumption and indirect costs, etc., put together, the end result basically is the import burden is much higher than if you just basically bring the finished product. Professor, do you agree? Am I logical?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I did a calculation about a company called Microcar in Sri Lanka. I don't know who is running it. I found exactly this problem. Do you know effective rate of protection given to that company is 600%. When you take into account and how much value added is adding to the country, how many people are employing. I think these things, I think we need to get clarified. Otherwise, we can't make conducive trade policy in the country.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Atkorola and Mr. Murtaza. I think now I think that we're past the time to close this discussion. But Dr. Roshan, I'd like to direct one final question to you before we wrap up. The question has come from one of our viewers on Facebook, stating that at the moment we are facing too many economic issues and the authorities are taking some ad hoc solutions. Can we prioritize 10 most important issues for the country that they need to address? Now, I believe our report tackles the 10 issues, but if you could, for the sake of some clarity, highlight maybe 2 or 3 points that you feel maybe has come from this discussion or is highlighted in the report as important, as flagging it as urgent in terms of reform steps.
Thank you, Anita. You said, I think we've kind of covered many of the points that that we feel needs to be policymakers need to take into consideration developing a program. But I think, as most of our speakers have indicated, we really need to put our macroeconomic management, or basically bring our macroeconomy back into a stable position. So, and those are things that are in the hands of the policymakers. So basically our fiscal policy and our monetary policy. We really need to bring it back on track. We know what needs to be done. Our policymakers need know what needs to be done. So I think that is kind of those are the really priorities at the moment, or really need to be done immediately. And I think everything else has to be done in parallel, but definitely some things more immediately, particularly some of the structural reforms, will take time to implement or get. I think that was also mentioned. So those will take time. So as I think again our panelists have mentioned, I mean, one of these, the IMF programs are developed in such a manner. Really, there are immediate policy reforms that are instituted as you go into program, and there are others that are that come into play over time. So this is nothing new. I think it's something that has to be designed carefully. I like the idea of what Professor Samarajiva said, that we come as a as a consensus, have a consensus policy building, because I think it has to straddle different political or governments, really, any of these programs. And that is, I think, the problem that we've had in the past, that we've had programs, but we have not completed them, because when the government changes, everything goes back to, we throw out that program or throw out those policies and then start from scratch. So I think this whole thing of consensus policy programs, which will straddle governments, is an important point, and which will help to keep the priorities in place and ensure that the reforms are taken right to their completion. Because otherwise we're going to just have this cyclical nature of going in and out of this macroeconomic instability. So that's what I want to say. But I think in terms of priorities, I think it's very clear. Basically, you have to put your fiscal house in order, you have to put your monetary policy and your exchange rate policy in order.
Thank you very much, Dr. Roshan. So I'd like to thank all our panelists today for giving a lot of their time for this discussion. It has been quite interesting and very fruitful. I would also like to thank our interpreters who made it possible for this event to be accessible in all 3 languages. If you're interested in learning more about this topic, the report is available on the Advocata website. So that's www.advocata.lk. I would also like to thank our streaming partners, The Morning Business, News Hub English, Other, Citizen.lk, and Economy and Business Sri Lanka. Advocata's social media handles are just about to be on the screen. And so if you are interested in this event and in events similar to this, please do follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, you name it. And you would be able to stay up to date on our work and our events. And finally, I'd like to thank our audience who has engaged with our discussion today. We've had over 50 people on YouTube, around 30 to 40 people joining us on Zoom, and over 100 people joining us on YouTube. So thank you very much. And good night.